The History of Philosophy, Modern Philosophy, Kant to the Present. Lecture 8.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we're going to pick up and conclude our discussion of pragmatism that we discussed last week. I hope to finish it this evening and prior to the break, and then after the break look at a closely allied but somewhat distinct movement known as logical positivism. Now you recall where we are in regard to pragmatism. I'll give you a brief summary in highlight form of the kind of points we've made so far. Pragmatists have rejected the Aristotelian and Objectivist view of the relationship between consciousness and existence. They've rejected the idea that there's an existence out there, a consciousness in here, and the function of consciousness is to perceive existence. They've rejected the primacy of existence, in other words, and instead developed the Kantian primacy of consciousness in a voluntaristic way. The mind, they say, I'm here just summarizing what we've covered last week, is not a spectator, not a faculty whose function it is to look out and study the nature of the world, but a metaphysically creative faculty which produces or processes or creates reality by means of the interpretations and conceptual schemes that it uses. Moreover, the mind, they say, is inherently a practical, action-oriented faculty, which by its nature is concerned only to produce plans of action. And that, as you know, is the pragmatist definition of an idea. An idea is a plan of action. The mind wants to produce plans of action in order to enable us to escape from troubling, frustrating, difficult situations. If the plan it produces works in a particular case, then that plan is true in that case. If it isn't, then the idea that that plan represents is false. The truth of an idea is simply its successful consequences, its successful functioning in resolving the initial problem, the tension and so on that gave rise to the need for a plan of action. Falsehood, on the other hand, is the failure of an idea, its impracticality, its inability to guide us successfully. Consequently, there's no such thing as an absolute truth. What works today may not work tomorrow. There's no such thing as facts out there which we're trying to know. What we call a fact is simply a habitual idea that we don't now question, we don't now doubt, an idea that now works well. As far as the future is concerned, we have to wait and see if it will continue to work. There are no absolutes. You recall also the theory of meaning of Person James, which I mentioned last week. I'll give you once more Peirce's statement of it just to remind you. Consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have, then our conception of these effects is the whole of our conception of the object, unquote. So a meaningful idea is an idea which claims to guide action, which tells us what to expect of the future, which makes some sort of prediction relevant to our future behavior. And the meaning of the idea is the actual consequences that it has on us as far as our action is concerned. The sensations we expect on its basis, the ways we would act differently if it was true. All of that encapsulated in their phrase, the cash value. An idea means its practical consequences, its cash value. And we gave several examples of this theory of meaning last week, how they would apply it, and we concluded on a discussion of the two main branches within the pragmatist school, the Jamesian, avowedly subjectivist branch, and the Peirce-Dewey attempt to achieve objectivity within the framework of pragmatism by saying that true is that which works not for this or that individual, but for some collective group. All right, let's pick up now. All of this so far should be clear because that's just a rapid synopsis of the last couple of hours. Let's pick up from here and see what further applications there are of the pragmatist philosophy. And to begin with this evening, let us ask what would a pragmatist position be on logic, on the status of the laws of logic. Now, these laws had been held by Aristotle, for instance, to be self-evident truths, the laws of logic, to be absolutes, stating facts of reality which were entirely outside of human choice or alteration. Is that the pragmatist interpretation? Well, obviously it is not. That sort of interpretation of the laws of logic goes out, or collapses as soon as you abandon the primacy of existence, as soon as you abandon the subject-object distinction, as soon as you abandon the correspondence view that the truth of an idea is its correspondence to facts. Remember, on this philosophy, there are no absolutes. Mind is an evolving mechanism, and all of its contents accordingly must evolve. And that must be true then of the laws of logic, like everything else. So the laws of logic, according to the pragmatists, are not sacrosanct. They are not immutable. One of their favorite terms for them is they are progressive. They are man-made. It may be the case that a certain law of logic works today to resolve the difficulties we're in, but tomorrow stops working. Well then, at and when the point when it stops working, we will have to institute a change in logic. In other words, on logic as on everything else, we have to be pragmatic. We have to wait and see by process of trial and error which laws of logic are most fruitful, which are not. As they like to put this point, logic is a tool, an instrument that human beings use in inquiry, like a saw or a hammer that we use in building, you see, but this is a different type of tool. But it's like a saw and a hammer in this respect. Like all tools, human beings create it, bring it into existence. And you judge it exclusively by its practical efficacy, by its success in achieving the purpose for which you created it. So long as it works, okay. So if and when it doesn't, you simply abandon it and develop a new tool. Any tool is man-made and therefore man-alterable if and when improvements occur to us. In a word, for the pragmatist, man actually brings logical principles into existence and creates their validity. He doesn't identify or discover their antecedent validity. It's not as though the laws of logic are facts independent of us, which man simply discovers. That would be the old view that the mind is a spectator peering out at some realm of reality, and of course the pragmatists have abandoned that. No. The man actually creates logical principles and makes them valid. And this is very explicit in Dewey's Logic. The introduction of that book, Dewey's Logic, The Theory of Inquiry, is actually comparatively intelligible for a book by Dewey. And if you want to read anything on pragmatism, I might recommend that to you. Here's a paragraph from Dewey's Logic on this point. Quote, "Logic is a progressive discipline. The reason for this is that logic rests upon analysis of the best methods of inquiry, being judged best by their results with respect to continued inquiry, the best methods that exist at a given time. As the methods of the sciences improve, corresponding changes take place in logic." Get that? When in the future methods of inquiry are further changed, logical theory will also change. There is no ground for supposing that logic has been or ever will be so perfected that, say, perhaps for minor details, it will require no further modification. The idea that logic is capable of final formulation is an eidolon of the theater. In other words, it is a fallacy. Now, if you say to me, well, are you talking about Aristotle's good old laws of logic, the law of identity, the law of contradiction, the law of excluded middle? Yeah, are you saying that according to the pragmatists, these are not absolute? And I say to you, you must remember there are no absolutes according to this philosophy, and that absolutely includes the laws of logic. Remember, in fact, the Heraclitean strand, which is very pronounced in the pragmatist philosophy. Everything is flux. What's so today is not so tomorrow. You can't step in the same law twice. In fact, if you really appreciate the Heraclitean element, you should be able to make a prediction. You should be able to think to yourself, well, if nothing is absolute, and Aristotle's laws of logic have worked for so long, we are overdue for a change. See, we can expect in the ongoing flux that it's now about time to change Aristotle's laws of logic. The very fact that they worked so long means that they must by now be outdated. And here's a quote from Dewey, rather explicit on this point. Quote, "The very fitness of the Aristotelian logic in respect to the culture and common sense of a certain group in the period in which it was formulated, that very fitness unfits it to be a logical formulation of not only the science but even of the common sense of the present cultural epoch," unquote. In other words, Aristotle's logic was so good for so long in Greek, in medieval, early modern times, by now it's ready to be superseded, you see. Now, you say, well, do they propose any alternatives to Aristotle's laws of logic? How would they analyze? Take a typical one, the law of excluded middle, for instance. Everything is either A or non-A at a given time and in a given respect. How could they say that that's capable of alteration? Well, here's a quote from a pragmatist, C.I. Lewis, comparatively recently deceased, from a book called Mind and the World Order, discussing the law of excluded middle from a pragmatist point of view. And he says, quote, "The law of excluded middle formulates our decision that whatever is not designated by a certain term shall be designated by its negative. That's our decision. See, whenever we're not going to call something A, we've decided we're going to call it non-A. That's it." And he goes on, "The law declares our purpose to make for every name a complete dichotomy of experience, instead, as we might choose, of classifying on the basis of a tripartite division into opposites and a middle ground between the two. Our rejection of such tripartite division represents only our penchant for simplicity and similar considerations," unquote. In other words, you see, we've decided we're going to dichotomize everything into two possibilities. You're either human or you're not human, to take that example. But we could have decided to structure our language and our conceptual framework such that there are three possibilities. You're either human, or you're completely not human, or you're half human. You're sort of human. Now, if we classified in that threefold way, it wouldn't be true that either you're A or non-A, because there'd be a middle ground in between the two. But we want things simple, and so far it's worked, so we accept the law of excluded middle. However, being pragmatists, we remember that there may be circumstances in the future when it may be more pragmatic to switch to 3 or 50 or 10,000 possibilities instead of just either or, at which case, of course, there are no absolutes. We try and see, and there are people who are trying and seeing. Now, if you say, but isn't logic absolutely necessary? Can't you say about the laws of logic if you can say about anything? These are really necessary. They must be the case. Here's a quote from Schiller giving you the pragmatist view of necessity, which is very explicit. Quote, "The necessity of a postulate is simply an indication of our need. We want it, and so must have it as a means to our ends. Thus its necessity is that of intelligent purpose of volition, not of psychical and still less of physical mechanism." And here's another good quote from him. "Behind the can't, there always lurks a won't. The feeling of," that's a good line to capture this view, "behind the can't, there always lurks a won't. The feeling of necessity, therefore, is at bottom an emotional accompaniment of the purpose of search for means to realize our ends," unquote. In other words, when you say reality, for instance, can't be contradictory, the real meaning is I won't think of it in a contradictory fashion. And that simply is my emotional resolution for the moment, because that would defeat certain purposes I have as of now. Now, of course, if it proves pragmatic, what I won't do today, I may very well decide to do tomorrow, in which case the old can't is gone, and the old law is gone along with it. We can decide to think differently tomorrow. Behind the can't there lies a won't. I think that captures the essence of the voluntarizing of Kantianism that I mentioned last week. Now, before we leave the topic of logic, I can't resist pointing out to you the rampant, extreme subjectivism that is implicit in this pragmatist view. Consider the following. They tell us the way to validate a law of logic is to show you that it leads to the fulfillment of certain purposes. You want to know whether a given law of logic is true or not, you judge by its consequences, by the purposes which it helps you to fulfill. Well, of course, the question immediately arises, how do you validate the purposes by reference to which you're judging logic? Could you hope to give a logical validation of the purposes that are being used as the standard of logic? Well, obviously not. You couldn't give a logical proof of those purposes, whatever your ultimate purposes are, because logic is justified in terms of leading to those purposes. So if you tried to give a logical proof of the purposes you were using as your standard, you'd be in an inexorable circle. You'd be saying, I justify logic by the purpose to which it leads, and I justify the purpose because it follows principles of logic. Consequently, if logic is to be justified as a means to an end, as a means to achieving a human purpose, then the purpose by reference to which you judge it has to antecede logic. It has to be pre-logical or a-logical. And what does that mean? It means you can't give a blessed reason for the particular purpose you choose, because till you have a purpose, you don't have any such thing as principles of reasoning, which means that your ultimate purpose is going to be some pre-logical, entirely indefensible whim, which is all that it comes down to. In other words, logic is a means of achieving subjective whims. And thus, in spite of all of its denials, the so-called objective school of pragmatism reduces to the plain, ordinary subjectivist school. It makes logic a matter of achieving perfectly arbitrary subjective purposes. So much for a word on the pragmatist view of logic. Now let's look at the distinctively pragmatist ethics. And here I want to focus on Dewey's ethics as the one which is most famous within the pragmatist school. It's sometimes called the contextualist theory of ethics, a very misleading name which is used by many different people. You'll see why in a moment. Well, let's begin with Dewey's ethics. Well, to start with, I point out there are two different ethical trends that Dewey claims to be opposed to. On the one hand, you may or may not be surprised to know, he claims to be opposed to subjectivism in ethics. Remember, in epistemology, he claimed to be opposed to subjectivism. Well, the same in ethics. A subjectivist in ethics is somebody who says, the good is whatever a person feels or desires. I feel it, therefore it's good. And Dewey says, explicitly and repeatedly, you cannot make ethics simply a matter of feelings. And here's a quote from Dewey. Quote, the fact that something is desired only raises the question of its desirability. It does not settle it. Only a child in the degree of his immaturity thinks to settle the question of desirability by reiterated proclamation, I want it, I want it, I want it, unquote. Well, that sounds pretty good so far. You see, he's vehemently anti-subjectivist. The fact that you say, I want it, I want it, I want it, doesn't yet show that it's good. So that's one trend he claims to be very opposed to. Secondly, he claims to be very opposed to any form of philosophic rationalism. Of course, the pragmatists are empiricists, and in ethics, philosophic rationalism amounts to the view that there are moral principles which you can reach by intuition or revelation from God or some sort of non-empirical mystical means. And Dewey is very often good on denouncing these supernatural mystical codes of ethics. He denounces them frequently on the grounds that they can't be practiced here on earth, that they're divorced from life. He frequently has many good things to say in opposition to the mind-body opposition in ethics. He's opposed to those who denounce matter and action and exalt unattainable ideals. We must, he says, pursue only attainable ideals. We must integrate values and facts, science and ethics, and not give up ethics to the mystics. That's, in effect, his big claim to fame in ethics, is to show how we are able to apply science to ethics, to show how we can have a scientific ethics, how we can use science to solve ethical problems. Now, as you would know, this claim from Dewey came as a big surprise to the philosophic world when it was put forth, because the legacy of Hume had been, you cannot possibly establish a scientific ethics, because a scientific ethics would have to be an ethics based on experience, and experience gives you only what is. It doesn't tell you what ought to be. It gives you, you know at this point, only facts, not values. So how are you going to ever establish a scientific ethics which doesn't appeal to supernaturalistic phenomena and also isn't subjectivistic? Well, that's what Dewey claims he's going to do, and that pragmatism has given us the key to be able to resolve this problem. He's going to give us a scientific code of values to enable us to achieve our practical purposes in life here on Earth, and he's not going to be supernaturalistic and not subjective. Well, you should be intrigued now to want to know, how does he do it? Well, in a general way, but it gets more complicated, in a general way, you understand we apply the overall pragmatist approach. Just as the true is that which works, so the good or the right is that which works. Remember James's statement that we mentioned last time? The true is only the expedient in the way of our thinking. Well, the right is only the expedient in the way of our behavior. So in a broad way, we can say that for pragmatism, the good is that which works, that which, when acted upon, solves our problem of the time, produces desirable consequences. Now you want to know, where does science come in? How does science come in here? Because the whole claim to fame of this approach is to show the role of science. Well, let's take first a schematic, abstract example. You are in a conflict between two courses of action, A and B, and you can't decide which to do. Now, the plain ordinary subjectivist will come up to you and say, do whatever you feel like. You feel like doing A, do A. You don't feel like doing A, don't do A. What's right for you is whatever you feel. Dewey says absolutely no. This is where we now appeal to science. We're confronted with a dilemma. Are we going to take A or are we going to take B? Well, you say, what is science going to tell you? Well, we have to find the appropriate scientist who studies this particular realm, but in a broad way, scientists study causal laws. They tell us the causes that are going to be required to get A or B, and they tell us the effects of achieving A or B. Science can tell us the means to achieve an end, and it can tell us the consequences. Well, what we do then is go to the appropriate scientist, and we ask him, what would be required to get A? What would be required to get B? In other words, what actions would I have to take as a matter of sheer fact to get them? And what are going to be the consequences? If I take A, what will happen to me? If I take B, what will happen to me? In other words, I determine from the appropriate scientist the means required to achieve these alternative desires and the actual consequences they'll produce. And then what? Now we've got all that information. Let us say the scientist has told us exhaustively, to get A you have to do so-and-so, and this is what will happen if you do it, and to get B you have to do so-and-so, and this is what will happen if you do it. And then what do? How do you decide? Well, says Dewey, you do at that point what you want to do. But, he says, but this is not a mere whim. Now, this is an intelligent wanting, an intelligent desiring. To be sure, your feelings are still the final court of appeal, but you don't, you see, act on what you feel just as such. You only act on what you feel after you have given intelligent scientific investigation to the means and the consequences of getting what you want. And I quote from Dewey, quote, values, to sum up, may be connected inherently with liking, and yet not with every liking, but only with those that judgment has approved, after examination of the relation upon which the object liked depends. A casual liking, a subjective liking, you see, is one that happens without knowledge of how it occurs nor to what effect, unquote. In other words, values are in effect the enjoyments which are the consequences of intelligent choice. Now you say, isn't something missing from this count of ethics? Suppose we consult the scientist. He gives us the means and the consequences. He tells you, well, if you take A, this is what will be the result. If you take B, this will be the result. How do you then decide which set of consequences is the one that's best? By what standard do you evaluate the means and the consequences that the scientist tells you? Take a concrete example. A person wants to decide whether to take dope or not. So he goes to the scientist following Dewey's pattern. Now I'll make this extremely simplified and we'll give him a good modern psychologist as the scientist, but just to get the pattern of the example. And let us say the scientist tells him the following. Well, if you take dope, that'll have the consequence that will lessen your immediate anxiety, remove some of your frustrations. You'll find you'll be in harmony with your particular social group, etc. Those are all factual descriptions of what will happen, let us say. But on the other hand, if you take dope, you may deteriorate physically. It has harmful consequences. You happen to be poor, you'll have terrible problems purchasing it if you get addicted, etc. On the other hand, if you don't take dope, the scientist tells us, to make it short, you may be healthy and wealthy. But on the other hand, your frustration may increase and your anxiety may increase and your animosity to people and so on. Now, the scientist, having given you that set of consequences, leaves the room. He's done his job. And it's up to you to decide. Now, obviously, you need some standard to decide how to weigh these particular consequences, which set is desirable and which is not. Do the pragmatists give you a standard? And the answer to this question is clear-cut: no. The pragmatists will not set any ethical standard at all. And this they do as a matter of principle. Or this they don't do as a matter of principle. Because any ethical standard would be an absolute. And of course there are no absolutes. So there is no such thing as some ultimate value or moral principle or moral standard by reference to which you judge the consequences of the action in any particular case. I've heard pragmatists, if you ask a pragmatist, well, shouldn't you, for instance, shouldn't your ultimate standard be your own happiness? I've heard pragmatists say, no, you can't say that you should live for your own happiness as an absolute, because, among other things, that's egoism. And of course, they wouldn't subscribe to egoism. Well, you say, should you say as your standard what the utilitarian said, the greatest happiness of the greatest number, make everybody happy? Is that the standard? And the pragmatists say, no. There are cases where you can't justify sacrificing an individual to the group, and therefore we can't say the happiness of the greatest number is the standard. Well, what about life? Oh, no, they say there are cases where suicide is justified, etc. In other words, any standard, past or present, that anybody has put forth, the pragmatists say there will always be exceptions to it. There are no absolutes. There is no such thing as the standard of value by reference to which you decide what to do in particular cases. Well, you say, how then do I decide? I've given all this information by the scientists. Now, what am I supposed to do with it? By reference to what code of values do I decide? And here I remind you simply of the pragmatist approach to thought in general, because it applies to ethical thought as well. Remember, all questions, all doubting, all thinking arise in a specific, concrete, practical situation. And the purpose of thinking is to get you out of the problem at that particular time. Now, no one, says the pragmatist, and I've heard them say this repeatedly, no one in real life ever sits down and doubts wholesale, across the board, all of his values at any one moment. That would be simply senseless, they say. If someone comes up to us and says, I doubt all my values, we can't do anything for him. Because as Hume proved among many others, and they agree with this completely, there's no such thing as a wholesale justification of a code of values from scratch. Hume proved that that can't be done, and the pragmatists agree with that completely. But their point is, it isn't necessary. We don't need to develop a whole code of values from scratch. We don't need a philosophic system of values derived from some fundamental value and all of it validated by logical means and so on. Ethical questions, say the pragmatists, arise in concrete situations. And in any particular situation, you already have a great many values that you don't happen to doubt in that particular situation. Nobody doubts everything all at the same instant, see. So at any given time, there's lots of values, judgments that you hold that you don't happen to doubt. Well, and it's very simple, says the pragmatist. Whenever an ethical eruption occurs and one of your values goes askew and you're in doubt and in problem, you decide what to do in that situation in terms of the rest of the values you hold that you don't happen to doubt at that particular time. And you say, well, just because I don't doubt them, how does that prove that they're valid? Well, you forgot last week if you say that. If you're not actually doubting them, then they're valid. They're still working for you in that particular situation. A valid value is an unquestioned or undoubted value. And in any concrete situation, you always have many such undoubted values. So what it amounts to is we solve today's problem today, and we worry about tomorrow's tomorrow. Now remember, there's no absolutes. The value that we appeal to today, that we don't doubt today, that we use to resolve today's problem, may be the very value that comes in question tomorrow, in which case we pull on some of the values that we don't doubt tomorrow to judge whether the one we didn't doubt yesterday but do doubt today is to be accepted or not, if you follow the grammar of that sentence. All of our values, to use the distinction we made last time, are dubitable. They can always be doubted. There are no absolutes. But at any given time, we only actually doubt the particular ones that cause trouble in that particular situation. If tomorrow there's a new situation, then we start doubting at that point the value that today we didn't question and use to resolve today's problem. In effect, sufficient unto the day is the problem thereof. Now you see why this is called contextualism, from the idea that the context of a particular ethical problem is the particular concrete situation that gives rise to it. Now then, of course, you may say, but then the pragmatist is not actually providing a code of values at all. He is assuming that you already have one. And all he's doing, at best, if you give him the most generous interpretation, all he's doing is telling you how to solve particular concrete ethical questions within the framework of your generally accepted code of values that you already have. And this question, if you raise it, would be a perfectly valid objection. And it indicates the extent to which pragmatism is a thoroughly parasitic ethics. Parasitic in the technical sense that it feeds off of other theories of value, other codes of ethics. You must already have a set of values before you can even begin to apply the pragmatist method of resolving ethical questions. If you were a pragmatist from scratch, and you didn't borrow your values illicitly from the utilitarians or the Christians or the Judaic tradition or Plato or whoever happened to be floating in the atmosphere, you would have no value content at all, and of course you couldn't function at all then. The pragmatists avowedly declare we have no way of providing you with a code of values from scratch. All we can do is tell you how to resolve particular situations in terms of already accepted values. You say, well, what would a pragmatist say if you asked him, but where did the original values come from? Since we didn't get them by pragmatists, means, well, the answer, to make a long story short, is really a paraphrase of a passage in Galt's speech. Remember the passage where he says the goods are here, how did they get here? Somehow, what caused it? Nothing has causes. Well, the pragmatist view amounts to the values are here. How did they get here? Somehow. What validates them? That's not a pragmatic question. And that, of course, is obviously a basic objection to the whole pragmatist approach to ethics. The result is, of course, that the pragmatists are just as subjective in ethics as the plain ordinary type of subjectivist that Dewey denounces. It's still the case that after all his appeal to the scientist to tell him the means of achieving his ends and the consequences of achieving them and so on, the pragmatist ends up by saying, I feel like doing X, therefore X is the right thing for me, because he doesn't give any objective standard. So if we borrow Dewey's formulation that I quoted earlier, we can say if the ordinary subjectivist says, I want it, I want it, I want it, and that makes it right, Dewey's concept of objectivity amounts to this. I've weighed the means and the consequences, and still, I want it, I want it, I want it, you see, and that makes it right. Feelings are still the standard. So we have as much subjectivism in ethics as in logic and in every other aspect of this philosophy. Now, just one last point on the ethics. They really mean the fact that there are no ethical absolutes. There is no knowledge for certain in ethics any more than there is knowledge for certain in any other field. You have to try and see. You have to experiment. You have to see what works. You have to give up the idea of unyielding, unswerving loyalty to moral principles. And Dewey is very explicit about this. I'd like to read you one last passage from Dewey describing what men would be like if they followed his ethics. I think this passage speaks for itself and requires no further comment. Quote, men, instead of being proud of accepting and asserting beliefs and principles on the ground of loyalty, will be as ashamed of that procedure as they would now be to confess their assent to a scientific theory out of reverence for Newton or Helmholtz or whomever without regard to evidence. Now listen to the next paragraph. Quote, if one stops to consider the matter, is there not something strange in the fact that men should consider loyalty to laws, principles, standards, ideals to be an inherent virtue, accounted unto them for righteousness? It is as if they were making up for some secret sense of weakness by rigidity and intensity of insistent attachment. A moral law, just like a law in physics, is not something to swear by and stick to at all hazards. Unquote. Now that certainly is, no comment could be made. I mean, that speaks for itself. Now let's look very briefly, in a few sentences, at the pragmatist's approach to political philosophy. In general, pragmatists are uninterested in the questions that were the central concern of traditional political philosophy. Traditionally, political philosophers were concerned to describe what the ideal state would be, what are the general principles governing the relationship between the individual and the state, what should be the proper functions of government, and so on. Those were considered the general theoretical issues that a political philosopher was probably supposed to be concerned with, and we had one system of another of political philosophy trying to give and defend varying answers to them. The pragmatists are, insofar as they're pragmatists, uninterested in this type of approach to political questions. They regard this as too theoretical, too abstract, not pragmatic. Remember, above all, we are to be concerned in our thinking with concrete situations. Consequently, when we think in politics, the question that should be of paramount concern to us is what to do here and now given today's specific problems. It's irrelevant and beside the point to start thinking in broad, general, abstract political principles. And Dewey says that he is impatient with, quote, get this, the waste of mental energy due to conducting discussion of social affairs in terms of conceptual generalizations, unquote. You get that? It's a waste of mental energy to discuss social affairs in terms of conceptual generalizations. Well, what should you discuss them in terms of then? Well, he wants us to focus on, quote, those specific inquiries into a multitude of specific structures and interactions, unquote. Which, roughly speaking, translates back to the point that thinking is a disease. Remember the dis-ease? And in some specific situation, something goes wrong. We then worry about what to do in that particular situation and how to tamper with the situation in order to reestablish some sort of equilibrium. In other words, political thought functions like all other thought, and the pragmatists are concrete, bound on principle. And of course, the advocates of this approach are legion today. You don't need me to give you examples of them. I mentioned a brief description of American foreign and domestic policy at the opening last week, and you see that concrete bound approach of solve this problem, stick your finger in this hole in the dike until it breaks loose somewhere else, and then stick your finger in there and worry about it and as it's crumbling around you. It's not pragmatic to go into abstract principles. There are no principles. There are no absolutes. We solve today's problem today and worry about tomorrow's tomorrow. That is the pragmatist approach to politics. We must remember, of course, that there are no absolutes in politics, as in anything else, and therefore we couldn't, if we tried, formulate an abstract set of political principles. We couldn't justify all men have absolute inalienable rights, nor can we justify all men absolutely are only fragments of the state and owe obedience to it. We couldn't justify any abstract political principle. We have to try each new idea that someone gets out and see if it works or not. For instance, Dewey at one point went to the Soviet Union to study what was then called the Russian experiment. Now, I may add here for accuracy that he didn't like it, and he was an active anti-communist, and so were many of his disciples long before it became fashionable to be anti-communist. Nevertheless, he did say about his trip at an early stage of observing the Soviet Union after the revolution that he had a distinctively pragmatist attitude to it. On the one hand, he said there were Herbert Hoover and conservatives of that sort who believed that the laws of economics doomed the communist system to failure on principle, you see. On the other extreme, there were the Marxists, the communists, who claimed that the laws of the dialectic process guaranteed that it would be a success. Now, he said, as a pragmatist, I differ from both. Both of these two schools are absolutists. They both think we know the truth, the principles operating, and therefore we can predict what will happen. Whereas, as a pragmatist, I characteristically, he says, have an open mind. I watch and see with great interest. You have to try and see what the outcome will be, and in advance, it's undetermined. You see if it works or not. Now, he didn't think it worked. He did add that he was happy that he was watching the experiment from this country. When pragmatists do advocate political views of their own, because they have no principles, you cannot get anything too coherent out of them, but the typical pragmatist on the street would be an advocate of a mixed economy. That's the type of system that would fit best with pragmatism politically. Since they have no basic principles in politics as in any place else, there's no absolute right or wrong political system, they would par excellence be the type that prides itself on being called moderate, as opposed to the extremists, you see, who attach themselves rigidly to fixed absolutes and say all men have absolute rights or whatever the system happens to be. Particularly today, pragmatists would tend to be advocates of the mixed economy because In politics as in ethics, they are parasitic. They feed off the prevailing value code. They adopt and absorb, as they're being brought up, the values that are presently extant in the culture. And since the prevailing values in America today are a mixture of pro-freedom and pro-collectivism, this is what is present in the mind of the typical pragmatist. When he consults his unquestioned values in any given moment, he finds a whole melange mixed of part pro-freedom and part pro-collectivist values, and therefore he will oppose absolute individual rights or absolute totalitarianism. There is, I may say, a pronounced slant to the left in pragmatists. As the country moves further to the left in general, the pragmatists are carried along. The ones I know, I may say, normally call themselves advocates of democracy, but they are extraordinarily vague as to what they mean by democracy. I've heard democracy by pragmatists characterized as a system which fosters, mind you, this as a political definition, a system which fosters growth, creativity, shared experience, and equality of opportunity. Now, you go and figure what political system would implement that. The one thing you can know for sure is that there'll be a pronounced collectivist bias, and that will be dictated by their epistemology. If adherence to society is the standard of the true, then society and its welfare will also be the standard of the good implicitly. So there's a strong anti-capitalist streak, a kind of woozy socialism, which is characteristic of most pragmatists, but it is woozy. One commentator that I've read on Pragmatism Sympathetic said that they are vague on principle because they don't want to commit themselves to some absolute, you see. They would give just a very generalized sketch, and then in particular cases we try and see whether it works or not. In other words, in politics it has no more cause-specific principles than in ethics. Now, I won't say anything this evening about the pragmatists' views in education. I had intended to, but since the brochure has come out, the Objectivist has been filled with articles discussing that, and I think on the basis of the material that we've covered here, if you read Beatrice Hessen's article on the Montessori method and Ayn Rand's article on the Comperchicos, you will be able to see without any difficulty the application of the pragmatist views to education. I want to conclude our discussion of pragmatism this evening by summarizing simply a few of the basic criticisms that could be made of the pragmatist approach. Now, these criticisms are legion, and I confine myself to just a few to give you an indication of what sort of problems are inherent in the pragmatist approach. The most basic criticism you can make of pragmatism is, of course, on the metaphysical level. Pragmatism is a version of the primacy of consciousness and is therefore, of course, vulnerable to all of the criticisms implicit in any form of the primacy of consciousness. I presume you are to some extent familiar with that point, and I will be discussing that in the lecture on objectivism, so I'll postpone a further discussion of that until then. You can see the primacy of consciousness very clearly if you just take the pragmatist formulation that the true is that which works. And what do we mean by works? Achieves certain purposes. And who holds purposes? A conscious being. So the true is that which satisfies the purposes of a consciousness. Now, if you ask a pragmatist, why do certain things work and not others, you will see even more clearly revealed the extent to which he's an advocate of the primacy of consciousness. I believe we touched on this point in the question period last time, but it's worth making because it reveals so nakedly the primacy of consciousness inherent in pragmatism. If you ask a pragmatist, why do certain ideas work and not others? It's not, remember, because certain facts are so and those ideas correspond to the facts, but the reverse. The fact is determined by what works. Well, why do certain ideas work and not others? A real philosophic pragmatist will say to you, that is an inadmissible question. You have to start somewhere. On any philosophy, For instance, if you take the Objectivist or Aristotelian view, you start with the fact that there are facts, that there's existence, that there's a reality. If somebody says to you, why is there an existence or a reality? You would say, well, that's an inadmissible question. Existence exists, and that's the foundation. Well, the pragmatist has the same thing on his side of the dichotomy, which is the primacy of consciousness. The irreducible axiom is there's a consciousness and certain things satisfy it. That's what we are given. Existence is what satisfies consciousness. See? And therefore you can't ask why do certain things work. That simply is the place we begin. Consciousness has certain purposes, and this is what satisfies it. And I think that illustrates vividly the primacy of consciousness inherent in pragmatism. But if you know what's wrong with the primacy of consciousness, that wipes out the entire approach. Another point I would make, just here as a brief reminder, it is not sufficient to argue against a philosophy. You must show what's wrong with the arguments which lead to it. So that it is very important, if you want to refute pragmatism, to answer the kind of arguments which I indicated last week, which claim to lead to it. Now, one source of these is, of course, Immanuel Kant, and his view, along with Hume, that you can't get necessary truths on the basis of experience. If you could answer that, then, of course, you would wipe out the Kantian basis, and since that Kantian premise is crucial to Kant, you'd wipe out that means. I've given you an indication of the objectivist way of answering that. The other thing, though, I point out to you is you should be able to answer the point that derives from the Descartes argument. You remember that argument that derives from Cartesian doubt? Man is a fallible being. How can he ever be certain of anything? And if he can't be certain, he can't claim knowledge. And if he can't claim knowledge, reality is unknowable, and therefore we have to reconceive truth in pragmatic terms. Now, it's very important that you be able to answer that argument. And I have not, in this course, said anything yet to answer that particular argument. I will reserve my answer to that until we get to objectivism, but I suggest that you think about that and see how would you answer the question, how can a fallible being ever be in a position to claim certainty? But if you could answer this Cartesian skeptic type of line and the Humean Kantian line, you would have undercut the very ground that leads to pragmatism, and that, combined with exhibiting the fact that it's primacy of consciousness, would fundamentally invalidate it. Now, over and above this, there are, of course, a legion of objections that have been made by opponents of pragmatism, and I'm going to just indicate to you one or two. These are not as profound objections, but they're all perfectly significant and valid objections, just to give you a short, so to speak, arsenal of equipment if you meet pragmatists. One point that we could make briefly is that even in epistemology, pragmatism is parasitic. You cannot be a consistent pragmatist even if you try. You must at some point revert to the correspondence theory of truth, the idea that an idea is true because it corresponds to the facts. There was a question last week, as I remember, intimating this, and I said I would answer it or explain more clearly why that's true, and now I will. And here's the explanation. Pragmatist says, when you say a proposition is true, that means it leads to certain consequences, and those consequences are desirable. So if I take proposition A and I say A is true, that means A leads to B, and B is desirable. Well, if I'm to know that A is true, then, I must know what? I must know that A leads to B and that B is desirable. Right? Since that's what it means to say the proposition is true. If I'm to establish that it's true, I have to establish that it has certain consequences and that those consequences are desirable. But now, the proposition that A leads to B, how will I establish that that's true? Well, a proposition is true if it has certain consequences and they're desirable. So to establish that A leads to B, I have to establish that it has certain desirable consequences and therefore is true. But how will I know that A leading to B has certain consequences? That's still another proposition. And to establish that, I will have to show that it has certain consequences, etc., etc. In other words, you are led to an infinite regress if you systematically apply this. Proposition A can be established only if you show it leads to B. But that it leads to B is only true if it works. In other words, that proposition C has to be established, but only if it leads to a certain consequence, because the truth is if it leads to a certain consequence. And then you have to show the consequence of the consequence of the consequence, and you are thrust into an infinite regress. Now, how could a pragmatist hope to escape from this type of objection? Simply by saying, look, this is ridiculous. When I say A is true because A leads to B, and you ask me how do I justify A leads to B, that's just a matter of fact that A, as a matter of fact, does lead to B. That's the way things really are. I don't have to justify that one pragmatically too, you see. But in other words, he has to appeal to the correspondence theory. In saying that a proposition has certain consequences, he has to assume it really does have those consequences, and that statement isn't true simply because of its consequences. Otherwise, we just have an infinite regress of consequences of consequences of consequences. That's one type of common objection, of a lesser sort, but still a valid objection. Or again, you could comment on the incredible number of false alternatives with which the pragmatist philosophy is riddled. Either you perceive reality, or you are concerned with action and practice. Either you're a spectator, or you're an actor. That kind of alternative, as we've seen, is all the way through the pragmatist formulation. They keep denouncing the perception of reality in the name of practical action. Well, of course, this is a completely false alternative. It's true that thought is ultimately for the sake of action, but successful action is possible only, to use their term, on the basis of spectating, only on the basis of perceiving reality. It's a nonsensical false alternative to say either you're going to believe you should perceive reality or you should be concerned with practical results. And in this sense, the famous historical figure who said, I came, I saw, I conquered, had the order just right, because you have to see first and then you can conquer, you see. Or, again, is another type of objection to the theory of meaning. Consider the pragmatist theory of meaning, which says, the meaning of a proposition is the cash value, the consequences you deduce from it. The meaning is the consequences to which the proposition leads. Now just think of that formulation in your mind for a moment. A proposition means the consequences to which it leads. Well, that should surely suggest to you a grave, grave problem on the part of the advocates of that formulation. If the proposition had no meaning apart from its consequences, how could you get any consequences out of it? You can have consequences of a proposition only if it has some meaning apart from the consequences. If it didn't mean anything but its consequences, what would be the it from which you're getting the consequences? As soon as you introduce the idea of the consequences of a proposition, you're distinguishing between what the proposition says and the consequences that result from it. Peirce says, consider what effects the object of our conception has. Well, then he's obviously clearly distinguishing the object of our conception from its effects. And he has to know what the object is before he can determine the effects. If I walk up to a pragmatist and say, Ishta triddledy toodle, what's the cash value? The obvious answer is, since it doesn't mean anything, you can't find any cash value. How would you find cash value as apart from knowing what it means? But that means you have to know its meaning first to be in a position to arrive at any knowledge of its so-called cash value. So pragmatism on this point is simply an incoherent view. And to take one last point, while we're still on the meaning theory, not only is the theory abstractly incoherent and contradictory, but it leads to utterly bizarre consequences. You remember the point that the proposition means its consequences. So if you say, for instance, I believe in God, and the cash value of that is a certain emotional and action type experiences on your part, then believing in God means believing in those experiences. Well, I think I'll let Professor Blanchard, in an early work of his, The Nature of Thought, who has a good chapter on pragmatism, has a perfectly apt comment on this particular aspect of the theory of meaning, and I'll let him speak on this point. Quote, "Pragmatism tells me, for example, that to think of God in the sense in which people for many centuries have supposed they were thinking of him is impossible. What people are really thinking of when they think of God is certain later experiences of myself and the race." Now, Professor Blanchard goes on, "It is certainly often difficult to say what one does mean by God, but of one thing I am perfectly clear. I do not mean by God a series of future experiences of myself and the race. Nor does it seem to me unduly assertive to say that I am in a better position to know about this than the person who questions it. To be sure, my meanings are sometimes so vague that another person could justly say to me, 'You really don't know what you mean.' But where the reference is moderately definite, gross confusion is hardly possible. If, so far as I can tell, I am thinking of my maiden aunt, I should be pretty confident that someone else would be wrong if he told me that this very same thought was a reference to the Codex Sinaiticus," that's a historical manuscript. "And I do not think it would be much more plausible to tell St. Thomas Aquinas, when he thought of God as existent but uncreated, that what he meant, though he did not know it, was a series of racial experiences that had not yet occurred. He took pains to be clear as to what he meant by God. He certainly knew what he meant by future experiences. And to say that to the end of his life he was confusing one with the other seems to me absurd," unquote. Now, I think that comment is absolutely well taken, and it is certainly true that the pragmatist theory of meaning is simply absurd in its applications, and it tells you what you really can mean by what you say. Well, let us summarize our discussion of pragmatism. We, the pragmatists, make logic a function of subjective whims. If you recall the point from last week, it makes general principles literally unthinkable. Of course, it makes reality entirely subjective. And were the pragmatists consistent, it would make truth of any kind, even pragmatic truth, unknowable because of the infinite regress point. It denies facts, it denies the law of identity. Remember, reality is indeterminate prior to investigation. It obliterates the distinction between consciousness and existence. That's just a brief inventory of some of the high points. Now, if I ask you, if you accept that, if you really accept all that, what will be the result? Well, to borrow from the pragmatists, I think the best thing to say in conclusion is that it does not work. I think the most appropriate final comment to make about the pragmatists is that with all their emphasis on the practical, the expedient, on what works, the actual truth is pragmatism does not work, it is not practical, and it expedites nothing but self-destruction. Let's take our break here. We're turning now to a different movement in philosophy. The broadest name for it is the analyst movement. The analyst movement, A-N-A-L-Y-S-T. And it is now the dominant philosophy in the United States and Britain among professional philosophers. It is not as influential in continental Europe, as we'll see. It involves a whole new conception of the nature and function of philosophy. As you could guess from the name, it's the view that philosophy is essentially an activity of analysis. What that means, we'll have to see when we get there. Now, for our purposes, I'm going to divide the discussion up into two parts, This evening I'm going to cover a group of analysts who were very influential in the decades from, about 1920-odd to 1940-odd. And this group from the 20s through the 40s was called logical positivists, or the logical positivists. Next week we will study the post-positivistic analysts, in other words, today's leading dominant figures and approaches in philosophy. The ones today are in many ways a development from the logical positivists, though they differ from them in certain ways. But our subject this evening is logical positivism. And first a word about the name logical positivism. The word positivism, as we know, was given by Auguste Comte to his philosophy. And one of the key meanings of positivism for him was that we have to abandon metaphysics, to give up metaphysics, which was just, if you remember, a primitive stage in the development of the so-called positive sciences. In other words, physics, chemistry, biology, etc. Now the logical positivists agree entirely with Comte in holding that we must abolish metaphysics as a field. But they do not believe that Comte's arguments against metaphysics were decisive. They claim that they can defend his opposition to metaphysics on much better grounds. That if we analyze the very nature of language and the very nature of logic, then the opposition to metaphysics can be established conclusively. So it will be like a positivism validated by an analysis of logic. And thus you see the name logical positivism. Positivism, the opposition to metaphysics, defended by a theory of the nature of logic. Now, people today commonly refer to the logical positivists simply as positivists because there are no longer any old-fashioned followers of Comte around, so you don't have to distinguish today logical positivists from Comtean positivists, and I'll simply follow that convention. I may mention that this school is also called logical empiricism. The term positivism took on certain bad associations in part because Comte in his later years, if you recall, went very mystical and had his special religion and so on. And therefore, although this movement was inaugurated as logical positivism, at a certain point they decided to change the name to logical empiricism because empiricism has good connotations in philosophy. And it's referred to by both names interchangeably in the literature. You can usually tell whether a person is a friend or a foe of this movement by the name to which he refers. So I say let's start then looking at logical positivism. Now a word about the men in this movement. There were a great many of them. I'll give you some names, but I won't bother you with dates. In 1922, a man named Moritz... I see. I mean, I wasn't going to give you the birth and death dates, but you should know that in 1922, a man named Moritz Schlick, S-C-H-L-I-C-K, who can be regarded as the founder of logical positivism. He was a professor of philosophy at Vienna, and he gathered around him a group of men interested in philosophy, although they were generally scientists by profession or avocation, and they called themselves the Vienna Circle. And they included names such as the following: Friedrich Waismann, that's, if you want it for the notes, W-A-I-S-M-A-N-N, Herbert Feigl, F-E-I-G-L, Rudolf Carnap, that's like it sounds, Philip Frank, Hans Hahn, H-A-H-N, Otto Neurath, N-E-U-R-A-T-H. None of these have achieved world fame. They were, however, the Vienna Circle, a militant group. They had a very clear, definitely defined positions on a number of questions. They issued manifestos. They had their own journal. The movement spread in Europe. Then with the rise of Nazism and fascism in Europe, the advocates of this movement fled to the Western countries, either to Britain or more predominantly to this country. And there were a great many of them came here, and there were, at least in the 40s and 50s, many noted logical positivists teaching here. You may have heard of Hans Reichenbach, who taught at UCLA for many years. Carl Hempel is a name you may have heard of. Charles Stevenson. And I might mention one famous British logical positivist A.J. Ayer, A-Y-E-R, who wrote his famous book, Language, Truth, and Logic, which is concerned to popularize logical positivism. There are two other figures I may mention, although they are not orthodox logical positivists. They were extraordinarily influential on the development of this movement. One of them is Ludwig Wittgenstein, a figure that we will reckon with again next week. In 1921, he wrote a famous work called the Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, which is Latin for logical philosophical tract or essay. And that book heavily influenced the developing Vienna Circle. Wittgenstein himself went through various incarnations or stages, and it's common among professional philosophers to refer to Wittgenstein I and Wittgenstein II. Wittgenstein I was early, and he was heavily influential on the positivists, and we'll take a look at some of his points tonight. Wittgenstein II is next week. I might mention also Bertrand Russell. Again, we'll look at him next week. He wasn't a positivist, but he was definitely influential on them. As I say, this movement was very influential from the 20s through the 40s. In the later 40s, it began to fade and among professional philosophers and informed the point of departure for later developments. There are no new positivists being turned out by the graduate schools today. In this sense, it's now extinct as a movement, but some of the old ones survive, especially in the United States, and their influence, of course, is very profound on the contemporary analysts that we'll look at next week. Now we want to look at the content of the logical positivist movement. In general, this is a very clear-cut philosophy. It has two fundamental principles, and that's all. And all the rest is simply applications and details of these two principles. These two principles are, one, the acceptance in full of the analytic-synthetic distinction with all of its implications, and secondly, a particular theory of meaning, which is called the verifiability theory of meaning. The verifiability theory of meaning. I'll treat these two principles in order that I've just given. Both of them, as you can guess, are Humean in their essence, and therefore this movement is really nothing but a neo-Humeanism. That'll become clear as we proceed. It is without question, in my mind, the least original of all 20th century philosophies. If you know Hume, there is nothing essentially different tonight, and therefore the points that I make we should be able to do comparatively briefly, and they should sound familiar to you. First, let's begin then with the analytic-synthetic question. Now, this we have covered under Kant, so I will simply remind you that there is, according to Hume, according to Kant, and absolutely according to the positivists, a clear-cut and firm distinction between necessary and contingent truths. A necessary truth is one that must be so, that has to be so. Its opposite is inconceivable. As against that, we have contingent truths, truths which happen to be so, but the opposite is imaginable or conceivable. And a traditional example would be, for instance, bachelors are unmarried. That must be so. It's a necessary truth. As against, for instance, say bachelors are eccentric. Now, let's suppose for a moment that it were true that bachelors are eccentric. It would still, say the positivists, be the case that it's just a contingent brute fact. It happens to be so, but it doesn't have to be so. Well, we have the question then, contingent truths we can obviously learn from experience. How do we learn necessary truths on the basis of experience? And the positivists agree fully with Hume and Kant. You cannot learn necessary truths on the basis of experience. From experience, you can only get what is, never what must be the case. Consequently, necessary truths must be learned independently of experience, and as you know, the technical name for that is they must be a priori. On the other hand, contingent truths must be dependent upon experience. They are a posteriori. Typically, the principles of logic, anything out of mathematics, any statement of a definition would be classified on the necessary truth side. whereas the statements of the empirical scientists and the normal statements of daily life would be classified as contingent. Now, empiricists had always been bothered by necessary truths, because you can't learn them from experience, and yet we know them. And the question confronting many empiricists ever since Hume was, how can we be in a position to know, apart from experience, all sorts of truths about the world which are absolutely necessary? Well, if you recall, John Stuart Mill had tried to grapple with this problem. We indicated his solution briefly several weeks ago. He tried to say there's no problem because there really are no absolutely necessary truths. The truths we call absolutely necessary are merely contingent, Mill said, and highly probable. We've had so many cases where we counted up 2 and 2 and it came out 4 that our associative mechanism has given us the habitual expectation we're going to have 4 whenever we count up 2 and 2, and thus it seems to us inconceivable that there'd be an alternative, but really, of course, it's only highly probable, and maybe tomorrow 2 and 2 will come up to be 5. That was Mill's way of trying to grant Hume's point that we can't get necessary truths from experience, and nevertheless all knowledge comes from experience. Conclusion, there is no necessary truth. Now the positivists could not take this approach of John Stuart Mill. They said it's inconceivable for 2 and 2 ever to equal 5. You could never even imagine what it would be like for 2 and 2 to equal 5. 2 and 2 has to equal 4. Now I've sometimes, for instance, I had a student once who said he could imagine a case where 2 and 2 equaled 2, and therefore he subscribed to Mill's position. I asked him to explain. He said, well, suppose you have 2 lions and 2 lambs. You put the 2 together, pretty soon you have 2 fat lions. And that's supposed to be an example of 2 and 2 equaling 2, and therefore a refutation that 2 and 2 equals 4. Well, obviously this is not a refutation of 2 and 2 equals 4. The principle that 2 and 2 equals 4 does not tell you if you have 2 things and 2 things, they will go on in perpetuity remaining distinct. It simply tells you if and when you have 2 things and 2 things, so long as you do, you'll have 4 things, you see. In other words, 2 and 2 is 4 is really necessary. It's irrefutable by experience. It is invulnerable to any future alteration by experience. Well, how do we account for this type of knowledge? If you're an empiricist who believes that you can know facts about the world only from experience, and here are absolute necessary truths, we couldn't learn them by experience, how will we interpret them? Well, here the positivists simply took their lead from Hume. If you recall Hume's distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact, they say the truths we call necessary are necessary simply because they are the results of our own human conventions. Our arbitrary linguistic conventions give rise to necessary truths. The reason that these truths are necessary, they say, is because we make them so. We decree that a word is to be used in a certain way, and once we lay down an arbitrary definition, that generates of necessity a certain truth. For instance, I'll perform one for you right in the process. I'll say a Trish I will arbitrarily define as a Coca-Cola bottle which loves Tchaikovsky. Well, I now can generate the necessary truth. All Trishes love Tchaikovsky. And that's got to be true. That's invulnerable. No experience will ever refute it because I've laid it down that I won't call a thing a Trish unless it likes Tchaikovsky, you see. Now, this is their idea. The reason that experience can never refute these necessary truths is that they don't say anything about experience. The reason facts of the world can't affect them is because they have no connection to facts of the world. They simply express the results of our arbitrary world usage. They're insulated from any possible problem in relation to the world because they're not about the world. Well, the positivists took this viewpoint, and they adopted Kant's terminology. They distinguished between the analytic and the synthetic proposition. An analytic proposition, if you remember, is one which is true solely, or which can be established as true or false solely by analysis of the meaning of the terms in question. The predicate doesn't add anything new onto the subject, it just explicates what's already in the definitions. On the other hand, there's the synthetic type of proposition where the predicate adds something new on. You can't establish it in that case by analysis, but rather by experience. And this is a straightforward distinction that we've already discussed. Well, the positivist view is that all necessary propositions are analytic, and therefore they are all conventional. They are all linguistic. They are all empty of factual content. They say nothing whatever about the world. Any necessary proposition is simply an expression of a human linguistic convention. And this viewpoint, for obvious reasons, is given the name conventionalism. Conventionalism being the view that so-called necessary truths are the creation of human linguistic conventions. On the other side, they say there are the synthetic propositions which do pertain to reality. They do tell us something about facts. They are not conventional. Now I'll let A.J. Ayer speak for a moment on this point. He gives this example of his view that he takes a concrete example of the law of contradiction and tries to show that it is true simply as a matter of linguistic usage. Quote, this is all of these from Ayer tonight will be from Language, Truth, and Logic. Quote, thus if I say nothing can be colored in different ways at the same time with respect to the same part of itself, I am not saying anything about the properties of any actual thing. But I am not talking nonsense. I am expressing an analytic proposition, which records our determination to call a color expanse which differs in quality from a neighboring color expanse a different part of a given thing. In other words, I am simply calling attention to the implications of a certain linguistic usage. Unquote. You get the meaning of this example. You say to somebody, nothing can be red and green at the same time and in the same respect. And then the positivist comes up and points to a table which is half red and half green. And he says, well, there's the thing which is red and green. And you say, oh, but it's not in the same respect. Then he says to you, well, what about a man looking at the table, at one side of the table with the red glasses and the other with the green glasses? Well, isn't that same part red and green? And you say, oh, but it's still a different respect because it's green in relation to the one with the green glasses and red in relation to the one with red glasses, you see. Well, the positivist says, every time I find a case where something is A and non-A, you tell me, oh, that doesn't count because it's a different respect. Well, all you're doing then is telling me the way you're using the word respect. The law of contradiction is simply a way of saying, I propose to use the word respect in such a way that whenever I encounter A and non-A together, I won't call it the same respect. Well, he says, fine, you're free to do that. That's your arbitrary linguistic convention. But it doesn't state anything about reality, and you could use the word differently. As Ayer summarizes, analytic propositions, quote, provide no information whatsoever about any matter of fact. In other words, they are entirely devoid of factual content, and it is for this reason that no experience can confute them, unquote. They can't be refuted by experience because they say nothing about experience. If you want a famous line of Wittgenstein's expressing essentially this view, it is, the propositions of logic all say the same thing, namely, nothing. That is to say, they have no factual content. It follows, therefore, of course, that all necessary propositions are really arbitrary. They depend upon the conventions that we use, and there are, therefore, alternatives to any and all of them. Now, this was implicit in the analytic-synthetic distinction for centuries prior to the positivists, but it was never explicitly emphasized and systematically applied to all necessary truths until the time of the logical positives. They were the first really to cash in on the analytic-synthetic distinction in all of its implications. They emphasize repeatedly that we create our conventions. We can, if we wish, therefore, use words differently. And if we do so, of course, we'll abolish the necessary truths that arose from one set of conventions and institute a whole different set of necessary truths. In this sense, all the principles of logic, of mathematics, all definitions are arbitrary. There are alternatives to any one. Says Schlick, quote, "The rules of language are in principle arbitrary," unquote. And here from Carnap, quote, "In logic, there are no morals." Meaning, you see, there's no such thing as a right or wrong way of using words. In logic, there are no morals. I'll continue the quote from Carnap. "Everyone is at liberty to build up his own logic, i.e. his own form of language, as he wishes. All that is required of him is that if he wishes to discuss it, he must state his methods clearly and give syntactical rules instead of philosophical arguments," unquote. Logic is simply a matter of our grammatical linguistic usage, so if you want to set up your system of logic, you simply have to give your rules. Another quote from Carnap, quote, "Let us grant to those who work in any special field of investigation the freedom to use any form of expression which seems useful to them. Let us be cautious in making assertions and critical in examining them, but tolerant in permitting linguistic forms," unquote. In other words, you can use language as you choose, and therefore all of logic, mathematics, is arbitrary, optional. It depends on the particular conventions you use. Says Ayer, quote, "It is perfectly conceivable that we should have employed different linguistic conventions from those we actually do employ," unquote. Now you can multiply these quotations ad nauseam. Now you can imagine from this that the logical positivists would find a fertile field in constructing new systems of logic to supersede the Aristotelian system. And after this liberating, in quotes, manifesto from the Vienna Circle that you're free to create logic as you wish, there was a whole spree of philosophers engaged in constructing new systems of logic to replace the Aristotelian system of logic. It became, in certain quarters, a new department of philosophy. How to make up your own system of logic or learn somebody else's. And there's a whole bunch of competing ones and whole divisions of philosophy departments which simply teach you set after set of different theories of logic based on arbitrary assumptions and arbitrary definitions. One thing in particular, for instance, which many of the advocates of these new logic oppose is the law of excluded middle. They condemn that on the ground that it's a two-valued logic. Two-valued, meaning, you see, you have only two choices. Either a proposition is true or it isn't. And they say, why should we be restricted to a two-valued logic? Why can't we have a many-valued logic? For instance, it has been proposed that we should scrap the convention that gives rise to the law of excluded middle and replace it with a three-valued system, according to which either it's true, or it's false, or it's doubtful. And of course, if you're ingenious enough, we can make up 100-valued logic. We give up the idea that it's either A or non-A and say it's 1% A or 2% A or 3% A. We have 100 possibilities and so on. So we have a proliferation of systems of logic depending upon the particular conventions that the school uses. How do you choose among all of these different systems of logic? How do you know which one to adopt? Well, some of the more forthright and open logical positivists said it's entirely arbitrary. You choose whatever system of logic you want. You don't give any basis. You simply say, here are my conventions. It became clear to them after not too long a time, however, that this view was enormously self-refuting. because it leaves the door open for anyone to take the logic that the logical positive has used allegedly to establish their philosophy and say, I have my own. It makes it impossible to distinguish logical positivism from schizophrenia. You know the case, is supposed to be a famous schizophrenic who argued that Jesus Christ, sex, and a cigar were identical. You know this case? And his reasoning was Jesus Christ is encircled by a halo. In sex, the woman is encircled by the man, and a cigar is encircled by the taxpan. In all cases, they have the attribute of encirclement, and therefore they're identical. Now, his principle of reasoning was A is B, C is B, therefore A is C. Now, he was regarded as very sick for engaging in that process. But, of course, if logical positivism is true, that's his convention. And there's nothing to choose between it and any other set of conventions. And consequently, no philosophy, including logical positivism, could be anything other than a completely arbitrary expression of completely arbitrary principles. Now, as this point percolated through the movement, most of them came to adopt the pragmatist interpretation of logic, and simply to say, true enough, we're free to choose make up as many logics as we want, but we should adopt the ones that work best, the ones that are most convenient. And of course, they're then vulnerable to all of the objections that we discussed under pragmatism. The general result of their use of the analytic synthetic proposition was to remove logic altogether from the discussion of any question of fact. If something is a necessary truth, then it's immediately linguistic, subjective, arbitrary. If you prove something by logic, by that very fact, it no longer has anything to do with facts. You see, if you prove it by logic, then it's necessary. If it's necessary, then it's simply linguistic and conventional. If it's that, then it's arbitrary. In other words, by this theory, if you prove something in logic, that makes it arbitrary. The very fact that you've given a logical proof of something removes it from any contact with reality and makes it simply an arbitrary convention. And the effect is to remove logic altogether from the discussion of fact. I was saying, just to conclude this point, that the result of the analytic-synthetic dichotomy as used by the positivists is simply to remove logic from any discussion of fact, which means that, therefore, any claim to fact is necessarily unproved and unprovable, which means that since logic is man's method of establishing truth, that we're going to end up in a complete skepticism, as you'll see. Well, that's all I want to say about the analytic part of the analytic-synthetic distinction. Let's now look at the positivist view of synthetic propositions. Now, synthetic propositions are supposed to refer to facts. They are supposed to have factual meaning. They're to be meaningful. They're not just representative of conventions. And the positivists raise the question, what is the criterion by which we can tell when they are meaningful or not? And now I'm going to give you then their famous theory of meaning. It's applicable, I say at the outset, only to synthetic propositions, because analytic propositions, while they consider them meaningful, are not applicable to facts, and therefore this theory of meaning that I put forth is not meant to apply to analytic propositions, simply to synthetic propositions. So you can forget the analytic ones for now. We'll go to the positivist theory of meaning. It's known as the verifiability theory of meaning. And it's the second major tenet of this philosophy. Well, let's lead up to the verifiability theory of meaning. To begin with, we're empiricists, the positivists are. Now, you should know by now already what to expect when somebody says that in a post-Humean era. Our only contact with the world, with facts, is by experience, by what's given to us through the senses, in other words, via sense data. Sense data are all we're directly given. That's all there is to talk about, all there is to think about, all there is to know, namely sense data. We can name them, group them, describe their sequences, period. Now that is essentially the Humean Comtean, Auguste Comtean view, and the positivists subscribe to this completely. But now we can draw some conclusions about what must a meaningful statement be. Well, remembering always we're talking about synthetic statements. A meaningful statement must ultimately be a description of sense data. That's all there is that we can be aware of, and therefore that's all a meaningful statement could be. Why do I say must ultimately be a description of sense data? Because there are, the positivists recognize, complex statements, which don't on the face of it look as though they are descriptions of sense data. For instance, if I say England declared war in a certain year, that doesn't look like it's a description of sense data. But the positivists would say you could analyze that statement into a series of statements about individual people and what they did. And each statement about an individual person you could analyze in terms of a series of observations that you make about that person. In other words, a series of sense data. So ultimately, no matter how complex our statements sound, we can reduce them back to primitive descriptions of sense data. That is the ultimate unit of knowledge, the element of knowledge. And all other statements have to be reducible back to descriptions of sense data. As one of them put it, the typical basic type of human statement is, "There, now green. Here, now moving." See, and so on. That's the ultimate unit of a meaningful statement, the direct primitive description of sense data. So a proposition will be meaningful only if it refers to sense data. Well, now we can draw a conclusion from that. If a proposition is nothing but a description of sense data, then it must be verifiable by a reference to those sense data. Verifiable here means capable of being established as true or false. Capable of being established as true or false. And if a proposition is nothing but a description of sense data, then, of course, it must be verifiable by a reference to sense data. For instance, if I make the statement, "It will rain tomorrow," that is a meaningful statement. It's a statement about tomorrow's sense data. And as such, of course, I can verify it if I just wait around for the right sense data. I know just what sort of experiences are such that if they occurred, it would verify it. If I wait around until tomorrow and I see a number of shapes, I'm trying to describe drops in sense data language, but a number of transparent shapes very close to each other, moving rapidly. When you put your hand out, you get the sensation of wet, etc. I know just what that state of affairs would be like. And consequently, that statement, "It will rain tomorrow," is verifiable by sense data and is consequently perfectly meaningful. On the other hand, suppose I have the temerity to say, I'm a Hegelian, let us say, and I say the absolute is all-encompassing. Now, I say to myself, what sense data would ever verify that? I don't know what to look for. I look everywhere, and I can't see. I see red, green, rough, smooth, hot, cold, but I can see the absolute is all-encompassing. Consequently, this statement, since it refers to no sense data, is unverifiable. It is, therefore, meaningless. I don't know what would make it true. Therefore, I don't know what it says. It's meaningless. And thus, we can reach the principle of verifiability, which I will dictate to you if you like. This is my own formulation of it, but I think it captures the essence of it. An empirical proposition is meaningful if it is in principle possible to specify a set of sense data which would verify the proposition if they occurred. semicolon. And the meaning of the proposition is the sum of these verifying sensory experiences. As I say, this is my own formulation, but I think it captures the essence of it. An empirical proposition is meaningful if it is in principle possible to specify a set of sense data which would verify the proposition if they occurred. And the meaning of the proposition is the sum of these verifying sense data. Or, if you want to put it even more briefly, a statement means what would verify it in sense experience. The meaning of a statement is the sense data that would verify it, and thus you see the name, the verifiability theory. So if we have a statement that no sense data would verify, it is accordingly a meaningless statement. It's just simply noise. It is gibberish. Now, this is obviously a very, very close relative of the Humean theory of meaning and of the pragmatist theory of meaning. It's a thoroughly sensualist approach to meaning. The only questions that we can allow as meaningful are those which can be settled by direct sense perception. Now, the verifiability theory of meaning has gone through a long and tortured history. The positivists put forth at an early stage one version of it, which they thought was marvelous and which would get rid of all sorts of meaningless utterances. And it turned out that it got rid of too many utterances, including things that the positivists themselves regarded as meaningful. So they tried to loosen it. And that was still too stringent, so they tried another formulation, and so on. And it went through a whole series of stages. If you want the whole story told in all of its brutal, bloody, step-by-step progression, the saga of the verifiability principle, so to speak, I refer you to a book by Professor Brand Blanchard called Reason and Analysis. And in the chapter 5 of that book, he takes you patiently and painstakingly through all the stages. I'm going to give you just a few high points in the exegesis of the verifiability principle. Well, in an early stage, it seemed to be interpreted as follows. They say a statement means the sense experiences that would verify it. Well, verify it to whom? We say a proposition has to be verifiable in sense experience, and whose sense experience? Well, it seemed obvious at the outset that if I, the speaker, am uttering a certain proposition, then it has to be me who's capable of verifying it. It has to be in my own experience. If the meaning of something is its verifiability in sense experience, it seems that a person could know the meaning of what he says only if he knew how to verify it himself. And so at an early stage it was taken that the verifiability theory was taken to mean a proposition is meaningful if it's verifiable by the person who utters it in his own experience. Now, this version led to a raft of disastrous consequences. Take only one simple question. What about if I make a statement about the past, about a time prior to my birth? I say Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo. Now, I cannot verify that in my sense experience. It's past. So if I interpret the verifiability principle as it's meaningful only if I can, as a matter of fact, verify it in my sense experience, then I'd have to say that that proposition, Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, is meaningless. It's gibberish. And of course, all of history and all past experience, all such statements then become meaningless. I may mention here parenthetically that Ayer at one stage took the bull by the horns and decided to put the following construction upon statements of the past. He said, how do we verify statements about the past? For instance, a statement that Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, because the meaning is the experiences that verify it. Well, how would you verify it? Well, today, you, for instance, go to the corner of 42nd and 5th Avenue. You check into certain records, books, historical documents, and so on. That's how you verify it. Well, he was actually prepared to say at one point, if that's how you verify it, that's what it means. And so the statement, Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, is just simply a shorthand way of saying, if you go to the public library and ask for certain books, you will see certain words on certain pages. I may say that was an early interpretation and seemed to be too much for the positivists. So they loosened the principle, and we get to another stage. I'm leaving out some intermediary stages, but just to take you along the path. The next significant change we'll look at is they decided a proposition doesn't have to be verifiable by me in fact, but only verifiable by me in principle. You get that? In other words, it has to be conceivable in theory for me to verify it. I have to know what it would be like for me to be able to verify it in sense experience, even if in fact I can't. So for instance, even though I can't be now at the Battle of Waterloo, I could imagine, if I had a time ship and so on, what it would be like to be there at the Battle of Waterloo, and then I would know what sense experiences would verify the statement. So, although in fact I can't verify it, I can at least specify the experiences which, if I were able to have them, would verify it. And that counts. That's sufficient to grant it as meaningful. And so on this stage we are allowed now statements about the past and statements about the distant future, because even though I can't actually verify them, I know what it would be like to verify them if only I was around to verify them, which I won't be, but if I were, I could. So we've loosened it to that extent. But now we go through another point that occurred to the positivists, and we reach the next stage. What if you have the temerity to make a statement about an event which takes place in somebody else's mind? Suppose, for instance, I'm talking about a third person, and I say, John is in pain. John is in pain. Now, I can't verify that in my sense experience. I can't experience John's pain. I can't even imagine a circumstance in which I could experience John's pain. It's worse than the Napoleon case, because at least I could say, well, if I were only there, I know what it would be like to verify it. But in the case of John's pain, I'd have to be John in order to experience it, and consequently I wouldn't be me. So it's impossible for me to verify in my experience the statement that John is in pain. Well, what do we do with statements, then, about the contents and events of other people's minds, since they're not verifiable in principle by you? Well, the answer that was given at one point was, well, how do you verify the statement? Taking the case of pain as the example, how do you verify the statement that John is in pain? Well, you verify it by observing his behavior. You watch him and he yells, ouch, he hops up and down, he grimaces and snorts and so on. And consequently, the statement, if that's the verification, that must be the meaning, since the proposition means the experiences that would verify. And therefore the statement, John is in pain, at one point was interpreted as being a shorthand way of saying, John is now hopping around, yelling, grimacing, etc., and so on. Says Ayer, and this, of course, was one of the roots of the psychological theory known as behaviorism. Behaviorism is the view that all psychological propositions, that is, propositions about mental events, can be translated into propositions about behavior. And of course, this application of the verifiability principle led directly to behavioristic interpretation. And didn't bother Ayer, for instance, I quote, I must define other people in terms of their empirical manifestations. That is, in terms of the behavior of their bodies, and ultimately in terms of sense contents, unquote. As he put it elsewhere, he has to, quote, reduce other people's experiences to one's own, unquote. So it's meaningless to say you are in pain, meaningless if you think you mean by that a mental event inside your mind. The actual meaning is you're jumping around, yelling, ouch, and so on. But then, of course, the question came up, is this a satisfactory analysis of the meaning? What about a consummate actor who jumps around and yells ouch and grimaces, but he's not really feeling pain? Or a person with terrific self-control who's feeling pain, but he doesn't give any external manifestations. So how can we analyze statements about pain in terms of overt behavior when there's not a correlation? Well, some positivists said, even if there's no overt behavior that we can verify it by, there's covert behavior. In other words, there's electric currents running through the brains and neurological jiggles and neurons racing around and etc. And therefore, if the statement, John is in pain, is not a summary of his overt behavior, it really is a summary of his brain patterns. And that's what I really mean when I say John is in pain. I mean his cerebellum is twitching to the left and etc. You see. The trouble was none of the positivists knew what was going on in the cerebellum and what to look for, so they couldn't give it meaning in terms of neurological phenomena either. Well, the upshot was they decided to loosen the principle once more. They decided to say, well, let's say that as long as something is verifiable by somebody, it counts as meaning. And this was the stage then. A proposition is meaningful if it's verifiable in sense experience, in principle, by somebody, by some conscious being, even if not by you yourself. If any observing being can verify it, then it will count as meaningful. So now I can refer to the past. I could even refer to John's pain because John can verify that he's in pain even though I can't. And we seem to have overcome some of the preliminary problems. Now this is more or less the central version of the verifiability principle. Verifiable in principle by anyone in sense experience. What sort of applications are there of it? Well, none of it is very different from what you're familiar with from the pragmatist view, so I'll just hit a few high points. What would be the meaning of the law of cause and effect on this viewpoint? Well, how do you verify it? What are the sense experiences which would verify it? Simply repeated conjunctions, simply regular sequences. In other words, the Humean view of causality emerges from the verifiability principle. If you say, well, what about the idea that there's a necessary connection between the nature of an entity and its mode of action? That's meaningless. There is no sensory verification, and consequently, there is no meaning in such a statement. Therefore, no fact entails any other fact. And Wittgenstein puts that this way, quote, any one fact can either be the case or not be the case, and everything else remain the same, unquote. In other words, the world is simply a mass of brute, contingent, disconnected facts. If you say to them, what about the problem of induction? What justifies you in generalizing? The answer is only the pragmatist answer again. It works up to now, and therefore we'll use it. If you say to them with Hume, but how do you know it'll continue to work if the world is just this brute set of contingent facts? There is no coherent positivist answer. If you try to say to them, well, look, the law of identity, A is A, requires the law of causality, they would say, how is that possible? The law of identity is just an analytic statement. It just expresses our linguistic conventions. And consequently, you can't get facts out of a linguistic convention. And therefore, the objectivist argument for cause and effect would be taken care of by the analytic synthetic distinction. Suppose you ask the positivist, to take another example, do you believe that anything exists independent of human experience? Sense data, or the things you claim exist, do they exist when no one is perceiving them? Is there, in other words, a real physical world independent of us or not? Well, what do you think the positivist answer would be? The proposition means but would verify it in sense experience. How will you verify in sense experience that something exists when you're not experiencing it? Obviously, you can't. Consequently, if it's unverifiable in sense experience, it must be meaningless. Now, this, I have a statement up from Carnap. He's discussing the question, is the physical world real? Is there a real physical world independent of us or not? And his answer is, quote, this is from Carnap, while from the assertion of the reality or existence of kangaroos, we can deduce perceptive propositions. From the assertion of the reality of the physical world, this is not possible. See, if I say there are kangaroos, I know what sense data to look for. But if I say there's a real physical world that exists independent of us, there's no way to check that by sense data. And consequently, he goes on, from the assertion of the reality of the physical world, you cannot deduce sense data. Neither is it possible from the opposite assertion of the unreality of the physical world. Therefore, both assertions have no empirical content, no sense at all. It is to be emphasized that this criticism of having no sense applies equally to the assertion of unreality. Sometimes the views of the Vienna Circle have been mistaken for a denial of the reality of the physical world. You can see why that would have been. But he says, we make no such denial. It is true that we reject the thesis of the reality of the physical world. But we do not reject it as false, but as having no sense, as being meaningless, you see. And its idealistic antithesis is subject to exactly the same rejection. We neither assert nor deny these theses. We reject the whole question, unquote. Now that's very clear and is a very typical positivistic method of analysis. We don't say there are things independent of our perception. We don't say there aren't things independent of our perception. Neither are verifiable by sense data. Both are simply meaningless. We reject the question. What's the positivist view of God? Obviously, same thing. You can't verify the existence of God by reference to sense data, one way or the other. Therefore, the statement there is that God is meaningless, and the statement there is no God is meaningless. Either way, because either way is not verifiable by sense data. Therefore, positivists frequently say you shouldn't regard us as atheists, because an atheist is somebody who says there is no God, and we don't utter that statement because it's meaningless according to us. We simply don't discuss the question one way or the other. Needless to say, religious people regard positivists as being an unsympathetic movement in spite of this. Well, I think you get the idea. It's essentially the same type of consequences that we got from the pragmatist theory of meaning. But we have still got a further problem before we leave this theory of meaning. Up to this point, the positivists were assuming that you could verify a statement with certainty, that you could be absolutely certain. Because after all you had to do to verify something was to check sense data. And they agreed with Comte that you could be positive about sense data. And so the theory of verifiability had been interpreted as a proposition is meaningful if you can verify it conclusively with certainty in sense experience. But at a certain point it began to occur to the positivists that on their views you could never verify anything with certainty. In other words, the skeptical side of positivism began to assert itself. And they began to come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as being certain of any empirical proposition. And that, of course, would require a further change in the verifiability theory. Because if verifiability means to verify with certainty, and certainty is impossible, it'll end up that everything is meaningless and that all human beings can speak is gibberish. Now, why would they hold that you can't be certain about any empirical matter of fact? Well, take a simple example. I point to this object and I say this is a table. That's a description of a material thing. This is a table. What say the positivists what I have to do to verify this conclusively, with absolute certainty? Well, I would have to check it from how many different possible points of view? Well, obviously, an unlimited number of points of view. Look, suppose I look at it from this point of view, and it behaves just right. The sense data is green, hard, and so on. And I move a quarter of an inch to the right, and I get a slightly different perspective, and that group of sense data follows. So far, so good, I say. The thing is behaving just like a table. I get another inch to the right, and it's still going. I say, fine, I got a little more evidence that it's a table. And now I take the next step, and suddenly the whole thing is gone. There's an elephant there. I say to myself, well, whatever it wasn't a table. A real table doesn't become an elephant when I take 4 steps over. Consequently, I say, if a thing turns into an elephant like that, I must have been wrong. It wasn't a table. It was really just a hallucination that was well behaved for a long time. Or it was really a dream that was well behaved for a long time. Now, remember, it's a contingent world. It's brute fact. Anything is possible. So how do you know whether there isn't some perspective somewhere on this table from which, if you looked at it from that perspective, you'd suddenly see something bizarre, which is incompatible with it being a table, and would therefore cast doubt on whether it's a table? The long and the short of it is, we'd have to make an infinite set of observations in order to establish conclusively that this is a table. We'd have to check it from every possible perspective, angle, etc., the underside, the top side, and then see that it's still holding tomorrow and so on. And you can't go through an infinite series, since the possibility always exists that the next set of sense data will conflict with all the preceding ones. We can never say with certainty this is a table. The most we can say is sense data from certain perspectives give a certain degree of probability to the fact that this is a table, but who knows what's coming next. So you can be certain. Needless to say, for these people, you can't be certain about statements of scientific laws either, because a law obviously involves an unlimited number of instances. If I say fire burns, that's all the fire in the past, all the fire in the present, all the fire yet to come. To verify that conclusively by sense data, you would have to experience every fire in the past, present, and future, and obviously an infinite number of fires. So they're in this position. A proposition is meaningful if you can verify it with certainty. But you can't verify any factual statement with certainty. It looks like, if we keep the verifiability principle, then every utterance is going to end up as gibberish. That was too much. So we reached the next stage, and you'll be happy to know this is the last one I'll give you. The positivists proceeded to distinguish between what they call strong verifiability and weak verifiability. Strong verifiability means verifying it conclusively with certainty. And most of them rejected that as being unattainable. Weak verifiability means approximately this. So long as there are some observations which are relevant to determining the truth or falsity of the proposition, it qualifies as being weakly verifiable. Some observations relevant. Even though you can never make it conclusive proof, if you can find some observations which are relevant, then that qualifies as weakly verifiable. Now, that particular theory also gave them grief, and I'll read you Professor Blanchard's description of this last stage that we will look at, as he has it, the weak verifiability stage. Now, a proposition is meaningful if we can find some observations relevant to verifying it. Blanchard writes, Mr. Ayer went on to formulate this theory in more technical terms. And then he quotes from Ayer. Let us call a proposition which records an actual or possible observation an experiential proposition. Then we may say that it is the mark of a genuine factual proposition that some experiential propositions can be deduced from it in conjunction with certain other premises without being deducible from those other premises alone. Blanchard will explain that in a moment. That's a close quote from Ayer, and Blanchard goes on, why this sort of formulation? Apparently to make clear the conditions under which a statement that was not strongly verifiable could still be admitted as meaningful. Arsenic is poisonous, for example. This is not conclusively verifiable because it would require more observations than could ever be completed. But it is clearly significant. How could this significance be recognized consistently with the requirement of verifiability? Only by admitting that a partial verifiability was enough. By this was meant that though the assertion was not verifiable in its whole extent, it still enabled us, when we took it in conjunction with other statements, to make confirmable inferences which we could not make from these statements alone. For instance, merely from John has taken arsenic, we cannot conclude that John will be poisoned. But from this in conjunction with arsenic poisons, we can conclude that John will be poisoned. And this conclusion can be confirmed by observation. The general proposition is thus at least partially verified by experience and may be admitted as meaningful or significant on this ground, unquote. If you followed that at all, and the technicality is not really worth following, but if you followed it, you see the problem is being opened now in the other direction. Up to now, in tinkering with the verifiability principle, the problem has been that there have been blatantly meaningful statements which came out as meaningless. Now, in trying to loosen it to accommodate these meaningful statements, they've ended up with a criterion that allows obvious gibberish as meaningful. And I'll give you one passage from Professor Blanchard illustrating this. Isaiah Berlin, one philosopher, pointed out that according to the new criterion, one could meaningfully say this logical problem is bright green, which is obviously gibberish, you see. Since with the help of another premise, I dislike all shades of green, one can deduce a verifiable conclusion not deducible from either premise alone, namely, I dislike this problem. Professor Ayer himself, 10 years later, agreed that the formula would not do. One could apparently prove by it that any indicative statement at all was meaningful. Take, for example, the absolute is lazy. That's Hegel's absolute. Attach to this any empirical consequent you wish, such as if the absolute is lazy, this is white. Then the statement this is white is then a verifiable one, which doesn't follow from either premise taken alone, but does follow from the two together. It thus fulfills the requirement for meaningfulness, and the statement the absolute is lazy must be admitted to all the rights and privileges pertaining thereto, unquote. Now that again was obviously too much for the positivists, and they were in this position. Whatever formulation they gave of the verifiability principle, something seemed to go wrong with it. We thought we just had one that would give us the regular, authentic, factual propositions, and it turned out that whole rafts of obvious, meaningful communication were gibberish. We loosened it, and loosened it, and loosened it, and at a certain point we thought, well, now we've let in only the meaningful and excluded the meaningless, and at that point everything got its foot in the door, and utter gibberish came out as meaningful. Now, there are still some people in this country tinkering with the verifiability principle and trying to find a formulation that will hold water. The majority of them, however, have given up with a sense of bafflement that a theory that started with this promising a future just simply petered out in formulation after formulation after formulation, and none of them ever seemed to work. Of course, the reason being that they're trying to give a theory for a conceptual being based on the premise that concepts are reducible to sense experiences, in other words, on the sensualist epistemology. And there's no wonder that they cannot do it. Well, in any event, so much for the verifiability principle. Let's pass on to a few last points. You should now be able to understand why metaphysics is impossible according to the positivists. We simply have to ask the question, are metaphysical statements analytic or synthetic? Well, are they analytic? Now, by metaphysical statements, we mean here statements about the nature of reality. That would include, for instance, the law of cause and effect, the idea that reality exists independent of human awareness, the question of God, the question of the basic constituents of reality, is it all mind and matter, etc. Well, do the proponents of metaphysical propositions put them forth as analytic? And of course the positivists would say no, because if they're analytic, they're simply conventional, linguistic, arbitrary. And no metaphysician says he's just spinning out his own arbitrary conventions. He claims that he is uttering factual propositions about reality. So his metaphysical theories can't be analytic, they must be synthetic. In other words, they must be empirical. But they can't be empirical either. They can't be empirical partly because we can't be certain about anything empirical, as we've seen, and yet metaphysicians put their views forth as certain. And secondly, of course, if they're empirical, then they mean only the sense data which verify them. And as we've seen, metaphysical issues, metaphysical questions cannot be verified simply by an appeal to sense data. So, they can't be synthetic because they are come out as meaningless under the verifiability question. And they can't be analytic because the metaphysician insists that they are truths about the world and not simply his linguistic usage. Metaphysical statements are supposed to be statements about fact which can't be verified by sense perception. Well, there's no such category. And consequently, metaphysical propositions as such, regardless of their content, must be what? Meaningless. Must be meaningless. Must be noise. As a matter of principle, any metaphysical proposition, since it's not analytic and it's not synthetic, must be noise. And there is consequently great hostility to metaphysics on the part of the logical positivists. Here is a quote from Carnap giving his particular analysis of metaphysics. Quote, "Now many linguistic utterances are analogous to laughing in that they have only an expressive function, no representative function. Examples of this are cries like oh, oh, or on a higher level, lyrical verses. The aim of a lyrical poem is not to inform us of certain facts, but to express certain feelings of the poet and to excite similar feelings in us. A lyrical poem has no assertional sense, no theoretical sense. It does not contain no. The meaning of our anti-metaphysical thesis may now be more clearly explained. This thesis asserts that metaphysical propositions, like lyrical verses, have only an expressive function, but no representative function. Metaphysical propositions are neither true nor false because they assert nothing. They contain neither knowledge nor error. They lie completely outside the field of knowledge, of theory, outside the discussion of truth or falsehood." Unquote. Now there's a very clear statement. Now you may ask, if metaphysics is this meaningless, this bad, why have philosophers indulged in it for so long? And the positivists have an answer of sorts. And the answer, in a word, is that philosophers have been duped by language. Been duped by language. They've been taken in by the way people use words. They don't understand the meaning of ordinary language statements, and consequently they put a false construction on language and they build their metaphysical theories accordingly. I'll give you one example of how this is supposed to work. This is an explanation I read from one positivist of how Plato's theory of universals was generated. Somebody utters the statement, dogs are faithful. And then he hears the statement, unicorns are fictitious. Those are two statements, right? Subject and predicate. And he reasons to himself, well, dogs are faithful. Faithfulness is an attribute which requires an entity, namely the dog, to inhere in. So there must be a dog. Well, now, unicorns are fictitious is the same type of statement. It's an attribute ascribed to an entity, and therefore there must really be unicorns for fictitiousness to inhere in. See? In other words, he construes unicorns are fictitious as being like dogs are faithful. And then he looks around and he can't find any unicorns in this world, so he says there must be a unicorn in Plato's heaven. See? And that unicorn possesses fictitiousness on the model of the faithfulness possessed by the dog. And that is seriously advanced as an explanation of Plato's metaphysics. Plato did not understand, or his followers didn't understand, simply that unicorns are fictitious happens to be a misleading grammatical way of saying there are no unicorns. If he had understood that, he never would have been tempted to postulate another world. He wouldn't have indulged in metaphysics. And this is a simple example of which the positivists give many. Metaphysics arises from the fact that philosophers misconstrue language. And of course the positives are eager to engage in the linguistic clarifications that are necessary in order to prevent the further rise of metaphysics. Now you may say, don't the positivists face a problem here? Aren't they themselves constantly uttering statements which are condemned as metaphysical by their own theory? Take, for instance, the verifiability theory. A proposition is meaningful if you can verify it in sense experience. Well, now let's apply the positivist criteria to them. Is it an analytic statement? Well, if it is, it's simply linguistic, arbitrary convention. And that means that the heart of logical positivism is simply a set of absolutely arbitrary conventions which don't have any binding power on anyone else, and there's no reason why anyone else should accept them. And the positivists clearly do not want to take the view that the verifiability principle is analytic. Well, is it synthetic then? Well, if it's synthetic, it has to be verifiable in sense experience. Now, how would you verify the verifiability principle in sense experience? Can you go around and observe, have sense data of meaningfulness and say, aha, this proposition is verifiable and I perceive that it's meaningful, and this one is not and I perceive that it's not? Obviously, you can't even perceive meaningfulness. So you couldn't possibly verify a proposition being meaningful by reference to sense experience. So you couldn't say the verifiability theory is an empirical theory. Well, if it's not analytic and it's not empirical, what must it be? It must be metaphysical. It must be meaningless. It must be nonsense. By the theory itself. Now, for what it's worth to you, I'll point out that Wittgenstein drew this conclusion. In a famous passage in the Tractatus, he writes, quotes, "My propositions are elucidatory in this way. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless. When he has climbed out through them, on them, over them, he must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions, then he sees the world rightly. And then his famous concluding line, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, unquote. In other words, by his own theory, his theory is nonsense. And he says, true enough, it's nonsense. And he doesn't continue. However, I asked that one qualification. He subsequently said that while it's true that a good deal of what he wrote was nonsense, we have to make a distinction between important and unimportant nonsense. I'll pass that by without further comment. Now, we're going to look at the positivist view on ethics next week, but I think you can see just without further discussion here that ethics will not fare any differently from metaphysics, and therefore it also will be expunged from the philosopher's domain, because it will neither be analytic nor synthetic. And so we come to the final question. What is there for a philosopher to do if he is a logical positivist? What is the function of philosophy? Philosopher, on the face of it, seems unemployed. All of the types of questions which philosophers had traditionally grappled with, the nature of reality, the good life, the ideal society, and so on, have now been all thrown out as outside the province of philosophy. Well, to a certain extent, the positivists agree with this. They say the philosopher has no special domain at all. There is no specific body of questions or information that is distinctively philosophical. After all, we can divide propositions up into the empirical ones and the analytic ones. The empirical ones, the ones that describe sense data, well, obviously the appropriate people to check them are the scientists. Philosophers have no special competence when it comes to observing sense data go by, and therefore we'll farm out the propositions that are empirical to the natural scientists. Analytic propositions, well, who is it that studies them? Well, obviously, the logicians and mathematicians are concerned to construct systems of analytic propositions showing that from certain premises, certain conclusions follow. So what then is there for the philosopher to do? Well, in a word, the positivist answer, the philosopher can simply clarify other people's concepts. That's all he can do. He can analyze and clarify the meaning of other people's concepts and utterances. And for the positivist, this meant primarily he can analyze and clarify the concepts used by scientists. For instance, scientists use terms like cause, force, necessity, and so on. Well, the positivist construes his function as, in effect, looking over the shoulder of the scientist, epistemologically speaking. He's like the handmaiden of the scientist. And he says to the scientist, you're using this term in a non-verifiable way. See? So you better check it again. You're not following the verifiability principle. Or, you confused a synthetic proposition with an analytic one. Now, this one you don't establish by sense experience. This is simply analytic. Or, you made a logical slip here. This doesn't follow from this. Or, occasionally when a scientist indulges in metaphysics and it rears its ugly head, the positivist will be quick to say, look, that's metaphysics, that's out. You see. In effect, you can think of it as though for the positivist, the philosopher runs a clearinghouse. As the propositions are fed to him as people speak, he farms out the empirical ones to the scientists, the analytic ones to the logicians and the mathematicians, and the metaphysical ones he squelches and doesn't let get on any further. But he has no domain, no field of his own. And I'll conclude this with one quote from Wittgenstein expressing this point clearly. The right method of philosophy, this is quote, the right method of philosophy would be this, to say nothing except what can be said. i.e. the propositions of natural science, i.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. That's the right method of philosophy. Continuing with Wittgenstein, and then always, when someone else wished to say something metaphysical, to demonstrate to him that he had given no meaning to certain signs in his proposition. This method would be unsatisfying to the other. He would not have the feeling that we were teaching him philosophy, but it would be the only strictly correct method, unquote. You get the idea. Philosophy has no field of its own, no distinctive questions. It's an activity of analysis. Now that's one early form of the analyst view in philosophy, and you see the extent to which it's an abdication from the traditional view of what the function of philosophy was. For the further developments of the analyst school, we will pick them up next week. Thank you. We only have a short period. I have a number left over from last week that I want to say something very briefly about, but here's one from tonight. Is it not better to say that the fallacy of the verifiability theory of meaning is not that concepts cannot be reduced to sense data, but that concepts and sense data are not interchangeable, because concepts are derived logically from sensory data, automatically integrated into percepts? If I understand this question, I would agree. And it's a question of what you mean by reduced to. Obviously, objectivism does not believe in innate ideas or innate concepts. Concepts are forms of integration of sense experience, ultimately. And in this sense, concepts are all derived from sense experience and reducible back to sense experience. But that is not at all what the theory of sensualism, nor therefore the verifiability principle which rests upon it, says. Sensualism, as I tried to make clear when I originally introduced the term, is not the view that the senses are the basis for concepts, but that a concept is simply the name for a group of sense data. That's all. There is no such thing as a conceptual integration distinct from sense experience, and that therefore man has only really got the faculty of sense perception, and a concept is just a name for a type of sense experience. Now, in this sense of reducing a concept to sense data, it's obviously not correct because it amounts to obliterating the existence of concepts. How can one justify any anticipated effects or expectations resulting from any idea, if not on the basis of logic or past experience, both of which criteria are pragmatically meaningless? This question, I think, is entirely valid. You can't, if you're a pragmatist, you have no basis on which to accept or validate your principles of logic, as I indicated in the lecture. You have no hope to a solution to the problem of induction, and therefore you cannot generalize from the past, and you consequently have no means whatever to know what will be the consequences of any particular action or any particular theory. You can neither use logic nor experience if you are consistent, and therefore I agree with this question that pragmatism is engaging in all sorts of stolen concepts in the process of propounding its view. If it is true, I'll try to intersperse some from, but there's some I wanted to get to. If it is true, according to Aristotle, that man is a rational being, how do you explain the majority of mankind's acceptance of such blatantly irrational ideas as those given from Plato through Dewey? Well, you completely misunderstand the meaning of what it is to say man is a rational being. To say man is a rational being is to say that he has the capacity to exercise reason. He has a conceptual faculty. He is capable of thinking abstractly and of thinking logically. It is not to say that under all circumstances and automatically everybody does think rationally. If you know the objectivist view, you will know that thinking is a volitional matter, and that it is possible for a being with the capacity to reason, not to exercise that, and consequently to come up with all sorts of false theories. Also, there's always the possibility of a person making an honest mistake. Now, I would say that in the case of the great majority of mankind accepting these theories, although they bear some responsibility for it, the primary responsibility is on the shoulders of the philosophers who fed them these theories. After all, there is a division of labor, and not everyone can take the time to be a full-time philosopher and figure out his own view of the universe and epistemology and ethics and so on. And in this sense, the majority of mankind is to some extent at the mercy of the philosophic theories which are given them by the philosophers who are influential. But in any event, the key point is you cannot say, because man is a rational being in the sense of having the capacity to reason, therefore it's inexplicable if he accepts irrational theories. If irrational theories are fed by the leading intellectuals and philosophers, it's not a wonder that a majority of people subscribe to irrational theories. Aren't Dewey's ethics seekers consulting absolutes, i.e. reality, when they consult scientists about the consequences inherent in their choices of action? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. They are. Dewey is back to the idea that there is cause and effect, which of course rests ultimately upon the idea that there's a reality, that it has a nature, that there are entities that operate according to certain laws. But if Dewey were answering this question, he would simply say, the scientist doesn't give you absolutes. He doesn't know absolute causal connections any more than anybody else. He simply says, on the basis of past experience, it's highly probable that if you do so and so, this is what will result. So that according to a pragmatist interpretation, the scientist does not give you absolutes. He simply gives you degrees of probability. You mentioned in your argument for logical positivism the law of contradiction. What is the law of contradiction? I know what the law of identity is, but I've never heard of the law of contradiction. Well, I better tell you that. The law of contradiction is simply a corollary or application of the law of identity. The law of identity says A is A. Everything is what it is. It has a specific identity. The law of contradiction is nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. Nothing can be A and non-A at the same time and in the same respect. And it's simply an application of the law of identity. If a thing were A and non-A at the same time, of course the A would cancel out the non-A and vice versa, and the thing would have no identity. Its identity would be obliterated. And therefore, as one application of it, the law of contradiction has been formulated. If ever you come up with the view that something is and isn't, that's a contradiction, if it's at the same time and in the same respect, and therefore out. And the law of excluded middle for the same price is simply the view that everything is either A or non-A at a given time and in a given respect, that there's no middle ground between A and non-A. That's called the law of excluded middle. In what category would a positivist put the proposition all truths are either analytic or synthetic? Is it metaphysical? Well, that's a good question. They would have a very hard time with that proposition, because is this a synthetic statement? All truths are either analytic or synthetic. Well, how would you go about establishing this on the basis of experience? I don't know how you would establish by a reference to sense data that all truths are analytic or synthetic. All of these are defined conceptually. There'd be no way of verifying it on the basis of sense data. Is it analytic? Well, if it's analytic, it simply is a linguistic, arbitrary convention that the positivists have chosen to accept, and why should anyone else accept it? So, what category is it in? Well, it's supposed to be a binding statement of fact, which is outside the province of sense experience to validate. In other words, it sounds suspiciously like it's supposed to be a metaphysical proposition. So if the implication of the question is the same objection applicable here as I mentioned in the lecture to the verifiability principle, the answer, of course, is yes. And you see, the positivists cannot escape this type of problem because they have reduced us to two categories of statement. If you're certain of some proposition, if it's necessary, it doesn't say anything. It's just an arbitrary convention. And if it says anything, you can't know it. Now, where does that leave their own philosophy then? It either is a set of linguistic conventions which is perfectly arbitrary, or you can't know that it's so. And yet they put forth with the air of certainty all sorts of claims about what constitutes propositions and truth and knowledge and meaning and so on, for which there is no room whatever in their philosophy. So I agree certainly with the implication of that question. As an instrumentalist, how does one personally determine the collective consensus? I assume the question refers to the Deweyan version according to which the true is that which works for society or for the group as a whole. If you ask everyone in the world, how do you know what they said? Well, here again, I think the point is well taken. You can't be certain of anything. No, there is no such thing as certainty. And consequently, in principle, you can't even be certain that the entire group subscribes to a certain purpose or a certain goal. So that typical pragmatists would, however, say, well, we've got to be pragmatic. If we interview enough people, even though their answers are in principle dubitable, you remember that point? They are not necessarily doubtful, so we don't have to doubt them as of now, and if and when some problem breaks out in the future, we'll interpret it there. Although, of course, they are still assuming there's a whole bunch of people, and they have views, and we can appeal to those people and describe what their views really are. In other words, they're again assuming the correspondence theory. Can you give the page numbers of your quotes from Brand Blanchard and A.J. Ayer? Well, I don't have the page number. The best I can do for you on Blanchard, without looking it up again, is to tell you that Chapter 5, if you're interested in the verifiability theory at all, I would certainly recommend Chapter 5. I believe the part that I read, yes, is on page 230 to 231. That's that part about this logical problem is bright green. From Ayer, I don't want to take the time to look up. It's also marked. I'll just suggest to you a chapter that you may find worth reading here if you want to study Ayer. Chapter 4 is on the a priori and gives his view of the analytic synthetic statement. Chapter 6 gives his ethical views, and Chapter 8 applies it to show how fundamental metaphysical questions are meaningless. I don't have the exact page. I think it was 39, but I can't seem to find it on 39. Here, page 79. I don't know if that'll help you because you may not have the same edition. I have a paperback Dover edition. Could you please repeat your definition of the verifiability principle? Well, I guess I'll have to get the pages out. This was my formulation of the verifiability principle, and it was this. A factual proposition is meaningful, or an empirical proposition is meaningful, if it is in principle possible to specify a set of sense data which would verify the proposition if they occurred. And the meaning of the proposition is the sum of these verifying sense data. Or if you want it even more briefly, a statement means whatever would verify it in sense experience. if there is, oh, now here's a shorter one, I think. Isn't pragmatism the same as hedonism? No, it's not really technically the same as hedonism, because a hedonist claims to give you an absolute standard of value, namely pleasure. A hedonist claims as an absolute, an ethical hedonist, that pleasure and pleasure alone is the good, and pain alone is the evil, and everything else is to be judged by this standard. In this sense, subjective as the standard turns out to be, it nevertheless is a claim to an absolute standard. Pragmatists criticize hedonists on the grounds that they commit themselves to pleasure as an absolute, and the pragmatist commits himself ethically to nothing as an absolute. He would not say, as I tried to indicate in the lecture, always act in such a way as to achieve your own pleasure. And he would not say, always act in such a way as to achieve the pleasure of the greatest number. He would not say pleasure is always the good, either your own or everyone else's. There are cases where you should give up your pleasure, or maybe even everybody's pleasure. His point is, you have to judge in each particular case, and he will not formulate a theory of ethics with a basic absolute value and everything else derivative from it. In this sense, the hedonism is a traditional theory. It went all the way back to Greece. And it was on the model of a traditional theory in that it said there was something which was the standard, and that was then to be your guide throughout all situations. But the uniqueness of pragmatism is its refusal to specify any standard at all, and to say that it is unnecessary. And one last one, if I can find a brief one here. Didn't the positivist already know which statements he wanted to regard as meaningful? And therefore, wasn't he really trying to develop a principle consistent with and only with these preferred statements? Yes, and the answer to that is certainly clear. If the positivists really followed the verifiability principle, they would never have gone through all the stages they did. They obviously, this is a criticism made by Professor Blanchard, they obviously had a criterion of meaningfulness in their mind in advance of the verifiability principle, by reference to which they tested each stage of the verifiability principle. They knew in advance that the statement of scientific laws, the statements about other minds, the statements about the future, about the past, etc., were meaningful. And they knew that by some criterion other than the verifiability theory, because when the verifiability theory came in conflict with one of these statements, they proceeded to alter the verifiability theory. And therefore, Professor Blanchard's, one of his criticisms is that the whole attempt on their part to generate a theory of meaning is entirely misplaced, because the only way you could test the theory of meaning would be to see whether it really shows that meaningful statements are meaningful and non-meaningful ones aren't. And to do that, you have to know in advance what's meaningful and what isn't. And consequently, he says the entire positivist attempt is abortive. So in this sense, I would agree with this. This is correct, you say? Would you be kind enough to re-explain the difference between a man-created law of logic and an antecedent law of logic? Yes. Now, obviously, there is a sense in which man creates the formulations of the laws of logic. That is the wording. Nothing can be A and non-A. A is A. The naming, the conceptual formulation of these laws is obviously a human creation. And no one would deny that. But prior to or apart from the pragmatist Kantian tradition, it was held that the law of identity, for instance, is a fact in reality, that in reality things are what they are, quite independent of us and prior to our recognition of any facts. And then man's function is simply to come on the scene in this connection, grasp the fact, and give a conceptual formulation to it. See? Now, the pragmatist position, however, is completely not that. Not that the law of identity states a fact independent of us, and our only function is to discover and conceptualize that fact, but that we actually create the law of identity in the same way we create hammers and saws. that the law of identity is simply a tool guiding our mental behavior. We bring it into existence. Not just that we discover it, but we make it so the way you build any tool. See? And that consequently, if human beings weren't around, there would be no law of identity. See? That's simply the application to his metaphysics, to logic of his general view that reality is indeterminate apart from human construction. Well, we'll have to stop here, and next week we will pick up the analyst movement.
This course continues with Lecture 9.